Hi, I'm Peggy Farren. Welcome to the Understand Photography Show, where we talk about travel, nature, and fine art photography. Today, we're going to be talking about finding and looking for and working with the light in your landscape photography with Sean Bagshaw. The Understand Photography Show is a podcast first, so if you're wondering why we don't have visuals, if you're watching us, that's why. But we do do a premiere on YouTube and a Facebook watch party at 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Fridays when we release the new episodes. So I hope you'll join us for one of them. And when you're on our Facebook page, go ahead and join one of our groups. If you go to facebook.com/understand photography, you'll see it says groups. We have two groups. One is just a general group called the Understand Photography group. And there you can share your pictures, your photographs. You can ask for advice. You can ask for critiques. You can ask, if you're having trouble with a lens, anything. It's a general group. Joe Fitzpatrick started Monochrome Mondays, so we do that. And then we also do Whatever Wednesdays. So those are days that you can share in that theme or just post anytime. We love to see pictures. The other group is called Selling Your Photography as Art. Now that is a support group. That's not a place to sell your art, but that's a place where you're going to learn how to sell your art. Share it with everybody. What do you put in your newsletter? Do you have a newsletter? Where are you going to sell your artwork online? Have you had any experience with this particular website? It's a support group for photo artists. So Selling Your Photography as Art. Again, both of those, they're just a click away on facebook.com/understand photography. Also on our website, we have our online classes, our signature classes, the 4 weeks to proficiency in photography, and you are going to learn so much in that class. It's an interactive foundational class. So I'm live for 2 hours every week so that I can give, live support. And it's a 2-hour class each week. There's homework every day, so you really get the information, sealed into your brain, so you really understand it. And you're going to learn how to shoot in the manual mode. You're going to learn different metering modes, which we talk about in today's show a little bit. You're going to learn about lighting, including flash photography. You really need to learn a little bit about your flash, even if it's just a pop-up flash. Composition, it's a really, really good class. Understandphotography.com. My guest today is Sean Bagshaw. Now, he is an amazing nature photographer, landscape photographer. He leads workshops and has online Photoshop classes, among other things. He's a pretty busy guy. And he's going to talk about light and landscapes. So welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Peggy. It's great to be here.
Thanks for joining us on the Understand Photography Show. Now give us the short bio of Sean Bagshaw.
Well, I'm Sean Bagshaw. I live in Southern Oregon, and I do landscape and travel photography mostly. Photography's been my full-time career for almost 20 years now. I think I'm on year 17 or 18 or something like that. And also, I used to be a middle school science and math teacher, so photography education has been a big part of my photography career. And I do lots of, tour guiding and workshops and a lot of online instruction through video tutorials and stuff like that.
And you especially are good at Photoshop, right? Or teaching Photoshop.
Well, yeah. There are people out there who are so much better at Photoshop than I am, but I do enjoy the process of developing images using Photoshop, and I've been using it a long time. And I think, if anything, my skill is being able to kind of break the methods I use down into steps that I can teach to other people in a way that they can kind of relate to.
Okay, that's awesome. And let's just start. Tell me your website before we even get started.
Oh yeah, so yeah, you can. My website is outdoorexposurephoto.com, and of course you can find me on all the social media stuff. And I have a YouTube channel, and I'm also part of a photography group called Photo Cascadia, and that website is photocascadia.com.
Okay, or they can just do a search under Sean Bagshaw. It's an easy name.
Sean Bagshaw is easy name, and there's not too many of us out there. So yeah, if you do that search, you'll definitely find me.
So let's talk about lighting and landscapes today. Now, you teach a lot, well, you do workshops, you do a lot of landscape photography and teach a lot of landscape photography. So what are the considerations that we need to think about in landscape photography as far as lighting goes?
Yeah, well, I guess, it sounds obvious, but I always like to say that, without light, there's no photography. That's what photography is all about. I mean, it's even in the name, photograph is a picture of light. And so without light, you don't have a photo. And how the light interacts with the things that we're photographing is one of the biggest elements in what a photograph's going to look like. Now, lots of types of photography, studio photography, portrait photography, product photography, things like that. The photographer can have some control over the lighting in a lot of situations. With landscape photography, we don't control the light. So we're kind of at the mercy of whatever nature is giving us in terms of lighting. So it's extra important, I think, for landscape photographers to know light, to understand light, and be able to recognize different lighting conditions and how that's going to look in a photograph of the landscape, and how they can utilize that to get the photographs that are the most photogenic. And so considerations for lighting in the landscape are, it's the same as anywhere, but like I said, you just don't control it. So things like intensity of the light, how strong is the light, what's the direction of the light, what's the angle of the light, is it high or low angle, what's the color of the light, is there a color cast, is it warm light, cool light, neutral light, and then also just what kinds of interactions between light and shadow affect images and kind of the feel of images in different ways. The difference between a bright sunny blue sky summer day and really stormy storm light, versus maybe fog or something like that.
Okay, all right. So let's say I'm going out, I'm on vacation. I only have 1 week to get all of the pictures. I've never been to Oregon, by the way. So I'm coming to your town or your area. So I'm going to be shooting all day long.
Okay.
So what's going to be the difference? Okay, so let's say I start at Cannon Beach. See, I've heard of it.
Yeah, good job. Cannon Beach, that's up north on the North Oregon coast.
Okay, I didn't know where it was. I just know Oregon.
Yep.
So I'm going to start there. Should I start there at sunrise? Or what's the best time of day there?
Sure.
Well,
Well, I think
that's where the sun is going to be setting in the west.
setting in the west. So yeah, on the west coast, if you want the sunset, looking out over the ocean, and you want that sunset in your image, then yeah, sunrise is not a good time because the sun's going to be rising completely behind you from where the ocean is. But that doesn't mean that there can't be great light at sunrise on the west coast. It just will be different. And so knowing where that light's going to be coming from and kind of setting yourself up and how you might frame your image based on where that light's going to be coming from. And even though the sun's rise might be behind you at Cannon Beach, if you've got the right kind of cloud layer, those colors and the light can kind of extend across the sky and into your frame. So I have a lot of sunrise photos on the Oregon coast with really beautiful sunrise colors in them. Doesn't have the direct sun, that's still behind me, but those colors have, kind of spread across the sky in the right conditions. So yeah, you could certainly get a great shot at Cannon Beach at sunrise.
Now, the only thing I know about Cannon Beach is there's like a big boulder in the water, or I guess it's beyond a boulder. It's a, what would you call that?
Haystack rock.
Haystack rock.
Haystack rock. There's a few haystack rocks on the Oregon coast because it looks like a big haystack. So every one that looks like that tends to get named that. But yeah, it's enormous. It's hundreds of feet high.
Is that going to be in the light shining on it at sunrise, or is that in shadow from a cliff? I don't know what's behind. Is there a cliff behind me?
So at Cannon Beach, you definitely do have, some headlands there, but that particular place, they're not particularly high. They're not big cliffs right on the beach. So Cannon Beach is a great place where you can get fairly early light on Haystack Rock, and Haystack Rock it is high enough that the sun does hit it fairly early in the morning when you still have that low angle, kind of warm golden hour sunrise light. So that can be great. There are definitely other places on the Oregon coast where you do have a much higher headland or a mountain right near the coast. And then so those beaches may not see sunlight until much later in the morning, maybe 10, 11 in the morning before the sun finally gets over the land.
So what about when, what if the haystack rock is in shadow? Would it be in shadow then earlier?
Yeah, so that's part of understanding the light. You've got direct light, and that's when the sun is visible in the sky, or visible to the thing that you want to have the light shining on. So as long as, it doesn't matter when sunrise was, if the sun is behind a hill or a mountain or a cliff or whatever's there from where Haystack Rock is looking, then no direct light will be hitting it. It will be effectively in shadow. It's the shadow of the earth, or it's the shadow of whatever the thing the sun's behind is, but it's in shadow. Now, but that's not a bad thing, because shadows are an important part. If you just photography, if you have all light and no shadow, that's a fairly boring photograph in most cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases. And we see that a lot in conditions I call front light. And that's where the light source is behind you and the subject, which is in front of you, is completely lit evenly, across the entire subject. So front light, the sun's behind you, the subject's in front of you, and there's no real shadow there. So when things are just all lit evenly, they don't have a lot of dimension, they don't have a lot of texture, they're less interesting, they have less depth and volume in a two-dimensional photograph. So having shadow and light both in an image at the same time is what gives photographs dimension and depth and volume.
Okay, so let's say the sun is hitting Haystack Rock. Can I position myself a little bit to the side of it to get the shadow on it? Or, I mean, I don't know, I've never been there, so I'm
Precisely, yeah. Well, fortunately there you do have the option. It's a big wide open beach, so you can walk up and down the beach and closer to the ocean or back away from the ocean. You can go north, you can go south. So you do have a lot of options to move around. Yeah, there's definitely some locations. If you're on the edge of the Grand Canyon, out on a point, you can't walk 100 feet to your right because you'll fall into the canyon. But there are places where you can move around, and that's a really good point, is to be aware of the light, what kind of lighting you want in your subject, and where you need to place yourself for that light to happen. Yeah, so if I put myself looking due west at Haystack Rock at sunrise, and the sun is coming up right behind me, then it'll be front light on Haystack Rock. Now, if I want front light in my photograph, then I'm in the right place. If I would prefer to have side light, so light coming from the side, and what that does is it makes directional light, so one side of the rock is illuminated and the other side of the rock is in shadow, and it's that transition from light to dark, or illumination to shadow, that allows us to see that as a three-dimensional object in a two-dimensional photograph. So our brains understand that, oh, there's light on this side and it fades to shadow on that side, and that lets us see the shape and the volume of that object. So if I want more depth in my photo, I'll put myself either to the north or to the south of Haystack Rock, so that when the sun comes up in the east, the light is hitting the east side of the rock, but I can see the east side and the west side. I can see the light and dark side of the rock at the same time, and that'll give that rock more dimension in my photo.
Okay, all right. So, so what I'm hearing is basically whatever kind of light you have, walk around your subject to see how it looks from one angle to the other.
Absolutely. Another really good practice to be in is, it's easy to get to a spot in landscape photography and kind of really focus on what you're photographing, the subject, and not think about the light. And so it's like, here's my composition, here's the thing that in my mind, I want to take a photograph of. And so you plant yourself there and you don't move. And if you, instead of thinking so much about just the physical composition, but think about light and light direction and all of those things, and move around and pay attention to how the light is changing the scene from different perspectives, let that also be part of how you decide your composition. So yeah, I would say definitely anytime I get to a location, I first of all try to understand where the light source is or where it's going to be eventually, and kind of pre-visualize that, but then also spend a lot of time walking around in the current situation of light and noticing how things change. So yeah, if I walk on this side of Haystack Rock, it's front lit. As I move around, it becomes more and more side lit. And if I keep walking around, now usually, unless it's a really, really low tide, you can't walk to the west side of Haystack Rock because that's where the ocean is. But there are some low enough tides. But if I eventually could walk far enough around Haystack Rock, I would see, oh, it's becoming now backlit. The sun is behind the rock. And so now I'm looking, instead of at a side of the rock with light on it, I'm looking at a side with shadow, and I'm looking directly at the sun, and that's backlight.
And how do you deal with backlight as a landscape photographer?
Yeah, so of the different directions that light can be coming from, front light is generally my least favorite. I
Okay.
love side light because of what we already said. You know, it gives texture and shape and dimension to objects. And then I also love backlight, but backlight is probably the most challenging light to photograph in, because the contrast is so great in the scene. Because if you have true backlight, if you're looking directly at the light source, which in landscape photography is usually the sun is so bright, and then you've also seen the shadowed side of objects, and the shadows are so dark. And that's a very difficult thing to handle in photography, because cameras don't handle high contrast as well as our eyes and our visual system does. So for example, I'm sitting here in my studio and I can look at my studio light, which is here, and I can see right down to the details in the light bulbs. You know, I can actually see the shape of the light bulb, even though it's very bright. And at the same time, I can look in the shadows under my table over here, and I can see everything that's under the table. And yet if I took a photo of that, the camera would see that probably as the light would be completely overexposed white, the shadows under the table would be completely underexposed black, and only a little bit of the midtones in the middle range would actually have any detail and color in them. So understanding that is really important, that how cameras are going to see that. So photographing backlight, you're dealing with that contrast range, and you're either going to have to do a lot of developing to try to recover highlights or open up and show detail in shadows, or maybe you want a silhouette. So you expose for the bright sky and you let Haystack Rock just become a black silhouette with no detail. Or I guess another choice would be, if you want detail in the rock, you expose for the shadows in the rock, and you can now see the textures and detail of the rock, but now your sky is overexposed white. And if there's no possible way to get everything all in one exposure with a backlit situation like that, then you can go to things what are called exposure blending. So basically you're making multiple exposures, and then you've got an exposure that's properly exposed for the sky, another one properly exposed for the shadows, and then you blend the best parts of each of those exposures together into one photo, so it looks like how you see it.
Okay, okay. And that's pretty easy to do in Photoshop, right?
It depends. There's different ways of doing exposure blending. There are a lot. I think the term HDR, which really just means high dynamic range, and for me, any scene that I can't get all of the light values in one exposure with my camera. Anything that takes more than one exposure is high dynamic range for me. Now there is high dynamic range software which will auto kind of blend those exposures together for you. So that's pretty easy. In Photoshop, I do it manually using layers and masking techniques. And that's a little more complex, takes a little more practice and skill, but I like that because it gives me more control over how the final blend looks, and I can make it look more natural, and I can decide how I want to blend those different exposures.
Yeah, and my opinion is learning layer masks is easy, but actually doing it is hard
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's tedious because you have to get in really close and but it's not hard to actually do a layer mask in Photoshop. It's just to get it to look exactly how you have in mind. That's
Yeah, exactly. That's definitely it. It's a skill, it's a craft, just like anything else. Someone could show you how to you know, use a pottery wheel pretty quickly. Like here's how it works. You turn it on, it spins, and then you mold the clay. But to actually make a good looking pot would probably, take weeks or months or years of practice.
Yep, yep. All right, so I'm still at Cannon Beach, and
Okay.
now it's noon.
Yes. Okay. So we had sunrise, we got the early morning light, we moved around, we got front light on the rock, side light, we moved around, got some backlight. Um, so now the sun is up higher, it's the middle of the day. And yeah, so for me, again, going back to kind of those fundamentals of understanding light, and we're still kind of on light direction. So, we've had the light coming from all those different directions, but now we're getting into light angle. So as the sun goes up during the day, as the day proceeds, the angle of the light gets higher and higher. And one of the other things I like side light and backlight. I also like low angle light because that low angle light is also when you get longer shadows, so you get more texture. And also low angle light, because of the way our atmosphere works, when the sun is closer to the horizon, you have more atmosphere, more of the haze and the particles that are in our atmosphere that color the light as the light passes through them. So that tends to be, give you warmer, softer light. And that's why we call those early and late hours the golden hours, because that light is a really warm golden color to it, which I love. As the sun gets higher and higher up in the sky, we lose the low angle. It becomes more high angle, and we also get more and more white light. It loses its warmth, so it's not golden hour anymore. And that can be challenging because when you've got high angle light, you don't get as many shadows. It's almost like everything's front lit all the time, no matter where you go and what direction you face. And yeah, the light gets more intense, it gets more harsh, and it gets less colorful. So that can be definitely challenging to photograph in, but you can still make great photos in the middle of the day.
What are you going to do?
So you just have to understand what makes, what the light's doing and where you can find lighting that does work. Now, it is possible to make very good, intense daylight photos, because you get really hard shadows if you have shadows, if the sun's not completely straight overhead. And so you can make photos where your compositions are about the interactions between the bright highlights and the dark shadows and kind of the lines those shadows make. But the thing I like to do the most is find what I call finding twilight in the middle of the day. Because twilight, which we haven't talked about yet, I'm sure we'll get to that, but twilight is
We're
when
only at I said
sorry.
we're only at noon.
Right, yeah, we're only to noon so far. So twilight, though, is when the sun is not up. The sun is below the horizon, so you don't have any direct sunlight hitting anything. All of the light that you're photographing in the landscape is being reflected off the atmosphere, off the sky. Well, you can find twilight any time of day by just going into the shade. Because if you go into the shadow, and this could be the shadow behind Haystack Rock, or the shadow of a building, or even the shadow of a tree, or if you get down in a deep canyon, we see this a lot, like the slot canyons in Arizona, like Antelope Canyon. You're down in the shadow, but in those shadows is reflected light. The reason why there's any light in the shadows at all is because it's bouncing off of things that the light is hitting and reflecting into those shadows, which is basically what twilight is. So if you go into shadows, you can find wonderful, soft, colorful light, depending on what the light's reflecting off of. One example I can give of this is I took a photo years ago in the desert I think I was in Utah or Arizona, and it was like cracked mud on the ground. It was 10, 11 o'clock in the morning. And that mud was really interesting pattern, but the light was very harsh and overhead and flat and contrasty. It didn't look really great. It was okay. But I thought, I wonder what it would look like if I use my jacket to just throw some shade where my camera was focused. And what I discovered was, without that strong direct sunlight and just shade, I saw other light that was there that the sun was blocking out. And some of that light was orange light that was reflecting off the sandstone side of this little wash that I was in. And that light, any parts of the mud that were curled up, that warm light was hitting there. And so those parts of the mud were orange. And then the other parts of the mud tiles that were flat facing the sky were blue, because they were reflecting the blue sky that was up above me. And those were very subtle, different colored light that was there, that was being just overrun by the direct sunlight. But by putting it in shadow, I could see that colorful light, and it also had this wonderful texture and direction to it as well. So the image in the full light versus the image in the shadow, completely different images.
So you need to bring somebody with you to hold your jacket, is what you're saying.
If there's no shade around, like where I was out in the middle of the desert with no shade, yeah, that was somebody to hold your umbrella for you is definitely nice if you can get one of those people. But like I said, if you can go into a canyon, or if you can get in the shade of a tree or the shade of a big rock, or even just behind a cliff or a building, you can find shadows and then look at what's reflecting into those shadows.
Okay. And so you're really, instead of these vast landscapes during harsh lighting, you're looking for smaller vignettes, it sounds like.
Absolutely. If it's a bright sunny day like that, for me, that's what I'm doing, because that's the kind of, I like softer, more gentle light, and I like colorful light in my images. So that's where I go looking for it. And it definitely has to be a smaller scene that way, because you have to work kind of within wherever the shade is. But if it's not a sunny day, if it's a cloudy day, then you can photograph all day long, because the clouds are like a big diffuser. They're diffusing that harsh light. So even in the middle of the day, you've got softer light. Now you can have really thick, dense clouds, which very little light is getting through, and that can be fairly flat and bleak, although still you can make good photographs in that. But I like what's called a bright overcast in the middle of the day, which is thinner clouds, and they're really acting kind of like a diffuser that, like, maybe a fashion photographer might use to diffuse the light on their model. But in the landscape, those kind of thin clouds are a diffuser across the whole land. And so you can photograph all day long in forests, streams, just wherever, and there is this wonderful soft light that it just looks great.
And here in Florida, we, like, Clyde Butcher is our most famous landscape photographer, and he takes pictures in the summer when we have those big, I forgot what those clouds are called, but those big fluffy clouds. They're white with a little bit of gray. What are they?
Cumulus.
Cumulus. But they are a subject in the photographs. I have a question about something you said a little bit earlier, because you said if you're in the harsh light, but there are some shadows, and you want to photograph to kind of show the depth. Where do you meter? Do you expose for the brighter part of the picture, or do you expose for the shadow, or do you use matrix metering, where it's going to kind of average out the light? How do you expose for something with like a harsh shadow and a harsh light?
Right. So this is where, as a photographer, you have some choices, to make, and you have to decide, what's the most important. Do you want detail in the highlights? And if so, you want to expose for the highlights, or do you want detail in the shadows? And if so, you want to expose for the shadows, or do you want to try to maintain as much detail in both the shadows and the highlights? Then you want to expose somewhere in between, or do more of a matrix type metering. For me, actually, I don't even really think about metering anymore, because our cameras have a tool that you don't have to worry about what type of metering you're doing or even where you're metering, and that's the histogram. So if you're a digital photographer, the histogram is a wonderful tool because regardless of where you're metering, the histogram shows you your exposure. And so if you look at that graph, if the graph is pushed way to the right, then you know you're overexposed. If the graph is pushed way to the left, you're underexposed. If the graph is right dead center in the middle, you know you have a very central or neutral exposure value. And you can just do exposure compensation and watch the histogram change to decide, where do I want my exposure value to be based on that histogram. And you can do that without worrying about what metering mode you're in or where you're metering from, just watching the histogram.
Okay. And for those of photographers who learn with me, that would be not using exposure compensation. That would be changing your ISO shutter speed or aperture.
Exactly right. And those are all different ways to compensate your exposure. I mean, if you're using some exposure compensation function in your camera, that's all the camera is doing, is it's changing one or more of those three things of that triangle. Yeah, so whatever you need to do to adjust your shutter speed or your aperture or your ISO to get the histogram where you want it to be for the exposure that you want.
Okay, so learning to read your histogram is pretty important.
Very important, very important. And you said, is there a, like a proper way to expose? I mean, watching the histogram is, for me, the most important thing, but the other thing is watching the highlights. So that's the right side of the histogram. If you run the graph off the right side, if you cut it off on the right, there's nothing you can do to recover the overexposed highlights. So for me, it's most important to not overexpose the highlights. And if my shadows are a little bit clipped or cut off, I've underexposed my shadows, you have a better capability of recovering information from the shadows than you do from the highlights. So not clipping the highlights is my priority.
Okay, so nothing crawling up the right side of the histogram.
Yeah, no spikes right on the right edge.
Okay. All right, so now it's coming in this late afternoon.
Right. So now really we just in the afternoon reverse everything that happened in the morning. So we're going to go through kind of all those same angles and colors and directions of light, just in the opposite direction that happened at sunrise. So yeah, as the sun goes down, the angle will get lower again, so the shadows will get longer and the light will feel much more directional, and you'll have the ability to move around different sides of objects and look at how the direction of light is affecting the light and shadow on that object. And as the angle of the light gets lower, as the sun gets lower in the atmosphere, it'll get warmer, and so you'll start to get into that golden hour. And yeah, so you can kind of just replay everything you did in the morning, only in reverse. And that's really actually a fun thing to do, because if you're in the same place, because light is such an important part of composition, I think, is that even though the physical objects are all in the same place in the landscape as they were at sunrise, the compositions will change because the light is coming from a different direction.
That's so cool. I think if I ever do get up there, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sit there at the beach all day.
Yeah, that's one of the great things that we have that we can do as landscape photographers. You can't go in and rearrange the set or change the lighting at will, but you can come back over and over and over again or stay in the same place. And it's wonderful because every time I'm at a location, it's a different scene and it's a different photograph. And I photograph different things because the weather conditions change, the light changes with the time of day, the light angles and directions all change with the time of year, because where the sun is rising and setting changes from season to season. So, and just clarity of atmosphere, all of those things change the light, and the light is what really determines what that scene looks like.
That's what you said about the time of year is such a great point. It's because I I have been doing family portraits on the beach at sunset for 20 years. And, in the winter, the sun is way south, and in the summer, it's north.
Yeah.
It's almost like whenever it's in the middle, like when it goes right straight down, I don't even know when that is, to tell you the truth. It must be
That would
at
that would
some
be at the
point.
equinoxes. So that would be the first day of autumn and the first day of spring.
Okay. Because I
That's
know
right.
by November our sun is pretty far south, so it's
Yep.
set, it sets on an angle pretty far. All right,
Yep.
so let's talk about one of your favorite times, Twilight.
Yeah. So this is I think a lot of people don't, not, well, I don't know. I think different, I definitely run across people that don't even think about Twilight. And that's one of my favorite times to photograph in the landscape. But I think for people that haven't spent a lot of time becoming attuned to light in terms of how it works in photography and noticing light, what's obvious to people who are just kind of getting into it is that, oh, well, bright light must be good light. And to have bright light, you got to have the sun up in the sky somewhere, you know. But the reality is that for photography, I really like more soft, dim, subtle light. And one of the great things is that cameras can take longer exposures. And this is something that we can't do as our visual systems don't do long exposures. So when things start to get darker, they just get dimmer and dimmer and dimmer for us. But as to a camera, as the light gets dimmer, we can have a longer and longer time that the shutter is open and keep the exposure value the same. So it can look, even though the actual light has become very dim, we can have a photograph that doesn't look that dim. And we can then photograph whatever that wonderful light is that's happening in those twilight hours. So the sun is now set, or it hasn't risen yet. That's what twilight is. The sun is below the horizon, and all of the light, there's no direct light from the sun hitting anything except for the sky. The sun is below the horizon, and the angle of the sun is going up into the sky, and that sky is a reflective surface, and it's reflecting that light back into the landscape, and that's what twilight is. And that reflected light is very soft, it's very smooth, but can still be directional. It'll come from most strongly from wherever the sun has gone down. And it also is very colorful. So, the early twilight, sometimes the early twilight is still more of a white light. You've lost the golden hour light, but it's more of a white light. But if there are clouds in the sky and those clouds have lit up orange, just right after the sun sets, then you've got orange light washing across the landscape. And then as you go further and further into twilight and the sun is going further and further behind the horizon, that light gets bluer and bluer. So that's why we call it the blue hour. And all of that can be photographed, and it can really have an interesting, beautiful look, I think, in photographs.
Now, do you have shadows at twilight, or?
So you do. Now, they're not hard edge shadows like we're used to seeing when we have direct lighting. But if you look, for example, we could take haystack rock, or we could take a tree trunk, maybe, for example. So the direction that the sun set is where the direction the twilight is coming from. It's bouncing off the atmosphere, and it's very subtle. But if you look closely, you'll see that one side of that tree trunk is a little lighter, and one side of the tree trunk is a little darker. And it might be barely perceptible to our eyes, but as that light gets dimmer with a longer exposure with the camera, that light to dark transition is very apparent in a photograph. So that tree has that dimension and depth and volume, and it's beautiful.
That's so cool. So now you say the sun is bouncing off the atmosphere. So is it going to be more colorful if there are a lot of clouds?
Yes, it can be. Yeah, the more things that the light has to reflect off of as it goes through, it gets down deep into the atmosphere and turns all those oranges and reds and purples and magentas and whatnot. If that light has something to shine on, that's when we see those colors. So if you've got just a very, very clear blue sky, you see not a lot of colors at sunset. You might see these kind of a band or a strip of nice colorful sky right at the horizon, but really nothing coming up over overhead. If you've got some clouds that warm, really rich light can shine against, it's almost like a movie screen, and that lights up, and that's that brilliant sunset or sunrise that we love to see as photographers. But the trick of that is you've got to have clouds where you are, but no clouds where the sun is. And that's what lets that light come through underneath the clouds from around the curve of the earth and light up those clouds. If there's clouds out where the sun is, those clouds block the light and it can't get to the clouds where you are to light them up.
Okay. I'm learning a lot here.
So we look a lot for, we talk about when we're out photographing in the landscape and it's not sunset yet, but we're looking at, or it's not sunrise yet. If we have clouds overhead, but we see a gap, we call a gap, which is, you know, basically a hole in the clouds out near the horizon where the sun is going to be either coming up or going down, then we get excited because it's like, ooh, we've got clouds where we are, but there's no clouds, or there's a gap out where the sun's going to be.
Wow. All right. So what if I only have one day at Cannon Beach and it's raining for half of the day? What happens then?
Yeah, so we don't always get the, you know, the light conditions that we want in the landscape. That's part of the fun of it, though, I think, is that you really are at the mercy of nature, and it really requires you to go out and just notice and experience what's there, and then think about what can you do with that. So yeah, rain on the Oregon coast is common. You get that a lot. So it depends if it's rainy and overcast, but it's dramatic overcast skies. You know, you were talking about something like Clyde Butcher's clouds. Even on a rainy day, there can be a lot of texture and mood and drama and what I call storm light in those rainy, stormy skies. And so in that case, I love that. I mean, I'll include the sky in my photograph and do lots of just moody, dark, stormy type of photography, which is just, I think, is great. However, if it's a really kind of flat overcast, it's a really thick overcast, so not much light's coming through, it's just gray and flat, there's no real texture there, then a lot of times I'll look for things that I can photograph without the sky in them at all. And this is the great time to go into the forest. Forests in overcast light look great all day long because they have very smooth, even lighting. Things like streams and waterfalls, and with that low light you can get longer exposure times because there's not a lot of light, and you can get, with those longer exposures, you get kind of the silky water effect, which can look really fun and great. And then also you don't have these bright hot spots of highlight in the forest or on the water.
Okay. All right. That's so cool. What was I going to say? Oh, I was just going to say, for us, we're in Florida where there's a lot of lightning. Get off the beach.
Fair point. Fair point. Yes.
You have a lot of lightning in Oregon?
We don't have a lot of lightning. I mean, we do have thunderstorms and we can have lightning, but it's usually, you know, a couple times a year sort of event, not every afternoon sort of event like it can be. I know probably certain times of the year in Florida.
Yeah, in the summer we have a thunderstorm with lightning almost every day.
Right. Which
So
would be that would be my dream, because I think thunderstorms and lightning and that kind of dramatic weather situation, you got to be careful, like you said, to stay off the beach. But what a wonderful opportunity to photograph dramatic light on a daily basis.
yeah, we have some amazing lightning photographers here. In fact, one guy, Jeff Coe, wrote a blog article on understandphotography.com on how to do it, and he made it sound so simple. He's like, just go out in your front yard. You don't have to make a big deal out of it.
Yep.
Well, that's a good point. I always overcomplicate things.
Right. Yeah, there's so much photography that can be done just right in your home or right in your backyard, which is particularly relevant these days, you know, when we're all kind of staying at home a lot. And yeah, it's just amazing what you can actually photograph. My friend Adrian Klein actually is working on an article for the Photo Cascadia blog right now, where that's his whole article is, what can you photograph in my house and around my yard?
Yeah, I've seen that. In fact, somebody asked me to do a talk on that for projects, in-home projects.
Sure.
So I'm working on it. It's a lot of work because you have to actually do the projects if you want to teach about it. So
Right.
last
Right.
night I was working on bokeh, and it took me hours. So anyway, all right. So let's talk about other kinds of light, like spotlighting and vignetting, and what do you mean by all of that?
Sure. Well, this is where it comes into that, light is such an important part, I think, of composition. Um, and I'll often tell people in my workshops, I'm the guy who's thinking of light first and the actual things, the objects second. So I'm the guy who could show up at the Grand Canyon and here's the Grand Canyon unfolding in front of me in all its, grandeur. And I'm photographing a rock facing the other way because that's where the light was interesting. Um, so for me, that's the first consideration is the light. And light in terms of being part of the composition, we learn about composition and, how to place objects in the frame, how to create things like leading lines, how to place, different primary subjects and secondary subjects so that there's a spatial relationship between them, how to make subjects maybe brighter because that'll draw the eye to the subject, and things that aren't the subject darker because they'll kind of fade into the background that way. So light can be used to do all those things. So leading lines, if you have some sort of light shadow interaction, that can be part of a leading line. It doesn't have to be, a path or a stick or a rock or something creating that leading line. It could be the edge of a shadow. In terms of highlighting your subject matter, yeah, if you can wait until the subject of your photo is in light and other parts of your photo are in shadow, that's something I call spotlighting, then that can create great subject, attention. You can do that. Mountains are great because there's a certain time of day when the high mountain sticking up is going to be in light while the rest of the landscape is in shadow. So your subject, your mountain, is now being spotlit. On cloudy days that are kind of spotty cloudy, when you have those pools of light that are kind of roaming across the landscape as the sun comes through the holes in the clouds, you can wait until one of those pools of light falls on your subject, and when the rest of the area around it is in shadow, you wait for that. And the same, depending on how you place shadows and light within your composition, you can create vignettes, which are a darkening of the edges of your photograph, which is something we do a lot in developing to kind of, again, create depth and draw the attention into the photograph. Well, you can create natural vignettes just by where you place shadows in your composition.
Okay, all right. And I want to tell you my Tuscany story because
Cool.
we went to Tuscany in the fall. We had a photo tour there with Stefano Caporali. See, I said it right that time. And
Nice.
Anyway, we get to this one location, and there was this huge cloud, and it gave almost a sharp S-curve line up the hill.
Right.
But then it attached to another cloud. And I whipped out my cell phone, and I took a picture of it. But by the time anyone got our real cameras out, it was gone.
Right.
But it was so cool. At least I have that cell phone picture.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I love about landscape photography is because the compositions are constantly changing like that. And you have to be watching. Sometimes you get lucky and you happen to be set up when one of those things happens. And other times we make our own luck by understanding and kind of being able to pre-visualize or maybe semi-predict, when something like that might happen. You're watching the shadows and the light move. Sometimes it's quick, like in your situation where those clouds were moving quickly and it was there and then gone. Other times it's a slow, as the earth is turning and the sun is changing position in the sky, you can predict, like, in 2 hours, I think that edge of the shadow is going to be here, and you can kind of have more time to get ready for it. But yeah, I love that idea that in the landscape, our compositions are constantly changing, and you never know when you're going to be surprised by something, kind of just serendipitous like that.
Well, another story is just because it happens in the swamp all the time. I live in Florida near the Everglades. So a lot of times there'll just be like a beam of sun on something. And you're
Yes.
just like, wow, that is so cool because it's dark and when you go deep, it's dark in there. So
Yep.
the spotlight, I didn't know what that was called. So that's kind of cool. But now after talking to you, I'm going to start paying attention to, I mean, I look at light, but I didn't think about anticipating where it was heading like that. And that is just such great advice. I love that.
Okay. Yeah, and that's
No,
in the forest is a great place for that. You have those spotlights because of the canopy, and there's some great light there. But the thing I want to photograph is over here. Well, if you can watch and be patient, like you said, that pool of light may eventually get to where you want it to be.
yeah, that's so cool. All right, now tell me how, now you use apps for planning when you go out to see where the shadows in the sun are going to be, or how does that work?
I do use apps, and it's one of the great things that we have available to us now is, this technology that's just kind of in our pockets all the time, our phones and all, they're computers really, and so the things that the information that can provide us, you know, wherever we are on the planet is pretty amazing. So I use mainly an app called Photo Pills, and I actually know the guys who developed that software, and it's just a really powerful app which can tell you any place on the planet for any point in time, where the sun's going to be, what direction it's going to be, what angle it's going to be. Same with the moon, same with the stars and the Milky Way. So all of your light sources in the landscape, you can know that ahead of time. So for example, if I would want to say, I want to know when at Haystack Rock on Cannon Beach, from standing at this place, will the sun set right behind the rock? And like you said, different times of year, the sun's setting in different places. I can use that app to find, oh, these are the days of the year when the sun goes behind the rock from that spot. And I can know that ahead
Wow,
of time and plan to be there at that time. So that kind of resource is just really useful.
that's awesome. Photo pills. Okay.
Yeah,
I've
Photo
heard,
Pills is that app.
I haven't used it, but I have heard of it. All right, so summarize for us.
Yeah, well, we covered a lot there.
I
So let's see
know.
if I can get this down into just kind of a chewable bite. So I guess for me, the takeaways are, first of all, light is photography. Light is, for me, the most important element of photography. Without it, we don't have a photograph. Second of all, that in the landscape, we're at the mercy of the light that nature provides us. So we're just going out, having to know light, pay attention to it, and work with what we're given. But you can also kind of make your own luck. So if you understand light, so you understand, for example, direction of light and where the light source is compared to where you are and where your subject is, that changes the lighting. So direction of light, angle of light, is it low angle light or high angle light? Color of light, is it warm light, cool light, midday kind of neutral white light? So paying attention to color of light. And then also being aware of light that's not direct light. If the sun's up in the sky, the sun is directly shining on things, but there's a lot of wonderful light that's reflected light. And so reflected light is, well, twilight is a beautiful time because it's all reflected light reflecting off the atmosphere. But even in shadows, you can have twilight or reflected light any time of, well, except for nighttime, I guess. Any time of day, you can have nice reflected twilight in shadows. And then, of course, using light and being aware of light, how it works for composition, the interplay of light and shadow, and how you can use those things to, as part of the landscape, to guide the eye, to illuminate or highlight certain subject matter, to do framing of the scene, to help the eye stay within the frame, and all of those things.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you. I mean, I got a lot out of this show.
Oh, good. Well, it's been great talking to you. It's fun, and you can tell I love light. I could talk about it a lot.
Well, we got the right subject with the right person, that's for sure. Thank you, Sean, so much for being on the Understand Photography show.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. I had a great time.
Well, thank you, Sean. I think that was really interesting. I think, we talk about landscape of photography a lot on the Understand Photography show, but really, really thinking about the lighting first is just, it's not it's not new. It's just something that I think Sean is really good at focusing on. And I think, at least for me, I'm going to be more focused on looking for the light first before I find my composition in landscape photography from now on. Thank you so much for joining us on the Understand Photography show. If you would do us a favor and leave us a review on iTunes, which is now known as Apple Podcasts, it helps us come up in the search engines, and that is so helpful to us, and we appreciate it. I'm Peggy Farren. Thanks for joining us on the Understand Photography show. We'll talk to you next week.